I remember reading that in the paper and was shocked because the city of Flagstaff expects us to obey their rules. They expect us not to speed and, not run red lights and so on. They should respect federal rules. They're basically giving the federal government the defiant finger gesture, and the federal government has as much authority here as the Flagstaff city government.
I've seen and heard that when a state is sued, that it's supposed to go right to the Supreme Court.
Yes, the Constitution says that a lawsuit between a state and the United States should go to directly to the Supreme Court. But that would be, in today's world, and really in the 19th century world as well, that would be very inconvenient because they can't take testimony, they have a very crowded docket. You really wouldn't get the kind of a hearing that you need to get something heard by a district judge and then appealing it to the Supreme Court. So the fiction that they use is that whether it's the federal government suing the states or vice versa, they always put an individual in there. So the federal government, it's the federal government versus Jan Brewer as governor rather than the federal government versus the state, and that's the fiction that allows them to get into the district court.
Is the sentiment against, in support of 1070 going to help your campaign in that, this isn't going to draw out voters? Can they somehow or other attach their support of Arizona against the challenges of SB 70 defer to you so that it's going to go hand in hand? You're going to help us win over 1070.
Right. That is the number one point in my TV ad, that I will defend Senate Bill 1070 and she won't. I just need to raise the money to be able to do that. I'm losing more Republican votes than any of the other statewide Republicans because I had a tough primary. And so, she's getting 11% of the Republicans right now, and no other statewide Republicans losing more than 2 or 3%. So I've got a job to do. But if everybody realized that I will defend 1070 and she won't, then I think they would vote for me. And so that's why it's so important that I raise money and get that ad on TV.
As you look at an effective defense of 1070, and you look to the past in terms of the history of cases that the opposition will use to terminate, so to speak, 1070, where do you think they have perhaps the strongest arguments that will have to be opposed and rejected?
Right. The issue is called preemption.
Right.
And what preemption says is if the federal government occupies a field, the states have to stay out of it. So, for example, the FDA regulates drugs. You couldn't have the Arizona starting to regulate drugs. Now, the issue is if the federal government hasn't totally occupied the field, then the issue becomes, is the state law in support of the federal law, or is it a contradiction to it? So I don't think the federal government has totally occupied the field of illegal immigration. There are things that states can do that, if somebody's obviously illegal, they can arrest them and so on. And I don't think 1070 is contradictory to federal law. It's meant to help the federal government. I see it as a force multiplier for the border guard, because right now we have border guard in the interior of Arizona. If local police have to enforce 1070, I have to figure out how to turn this off. If border guard have to enforce 1070, I'm sorry, if local police have to enforce any illegal immigration law, then the border guard can be on the border where we need them, as I was talking about, 6 people every 12 miles. So I see it as a bill to help the federal government and not to contradict it. And my disagreement with the judge is, she thinks that the fact you have to report puts a burden on them. I say they have to do their job, and it's not a contradiction.
When the opposition looks at previous cases that will justify their position, are there any of those cases that are relevant to the situation today?
Well, there's a large body of law dealing with the doctrine of preemption.
Right.
And so it's a two-stage analysis. Number one, did the federal government occupy the field completely, in which case state has to stay out, like in drug regulation. Number two, if it didn't occupy the field completely, is this consistent or inconsistent with federal law? And I say it's consistent. Judy?
This is probably totally off the wall, but considering how many states jumped on the bandwagon when we passed 1070, If it became necessary, would it be possible for us to sue the federal government for dereliction of duty?
Well,
Because they're not doing their job.
yeah, I've been saying this as a fantasy for 8 years now.
Okay.
You know, I'd love to sue the federal government for negligence because, you know, there was a study done by the Pew Hispanic Trust about 3 or 4 years ago at a time when we had 150,000 students that were English language learners. And their study showed that 125,000 out of the 150,000 were children of people who crossed the border illegally. Now, half of them were born here, so they were citizens, but they were all 125,000 were children of people who crossed the border illegally. And we spent about $6,000 per student. That's even basic, not including the fact that we spend more on the English language learners than we spend on the other kids. So that's $700 million a year. And so I've always felt like it was a temptation to sue the federal government for malpractice at the border for costing us $700 million a year. Now, to illustrate how ridiculous things can get, in the Flores case, the federal judge, before I got him reversed, had said not only was he going to tell us how much to spend, rather than we decide how much to spend, but the whole burden of what he determined would have to be borne by the state taxpayers. And the little money that we do get from the federal government, because we get money under Title III for English language learners, we get money under Title I for poor kids, would be gravy. It couldn't count. That would be displacement, or what do they call it, Karen, that you can't do.
Oh, supplanting. Supplanting?
Supplanting, it would be supplanting. So here you have a situation, it's federal negligence that causes the $700 million cost, and a federal judge saying, in meeting my federal dictate that you spend more money, you have to do all that with state money, and you can't even count the money you're getting from the federal government. That shows how ridiculous things are. Here.
Short one. In all the debate about 1070, when it was at the height of everyone's attention, I read and heard that basically California and Rhode Island both have very, very similar statutes and have had them for years without consequence or anything. Is that true, and how different were they?
I'm not sure I can testify that I've looked at it to determine it, but I think that it illustrates the fact that there was a lot of exaggerating and overreaction that went on. And I think one of the roles of the Attorney General is to make sure that the police are trained not to do racial profiling, because that was the fear. There's an organization called, its acronym is POST, that does the actual training. The Attorney General supplies most of the people who do the training. And one of my goals as Attorney General would be sure that people are well trained not to do racial profiling, so that then as people saw that we were not doing racial profiling, I think a lot of the national uproar would die down and boycotts and so on.
I think I know the answer to this, but when kids apply to go to public school, is their immigration status checked?
No, there's a federal, there's a United States Supreme Court case called Plyler versus Doe that says that public education is a constitutional right. Now, people who cross the border in violation of our law, are breaking law, they waive some of their constitutional rights. But the kids that they bring with them are not making that choice. They're just being brought involuntarily, and therefore we are not allowed to inquire as to the legality of the status of the kids' parents if they live here. But we had a problem with kids who didn't live, not only weren't legal, they weren't resident in Arizona, they were residents of Sonora, and they were crossing the border at Lukeville, which is a border town, where the Pima County superintendent sent buses down to pick them up and bring them to Ajo, and then Ajo was charging us to pay the cost of educating these kids that were residents of Sonora. Their parents were paying taxes in Sonora. They should have been going to the Sonoran public schools. The superintendent of Pima County is a Republican, but you'd be hard to tell. I mean, we had a big fight with her. I finally put enough pressure on her that she agreed to check their residencies, because there was an RV park in Lukeville that was selling fake addresses that the kids could claim as their address. There was nothing there. And so she agreed to send out registered letters, and if they came back there was no one there, they wouldn't be able to get on the bus, and the bus wouldn't stop at the apartment house in Lukeville, which has legitimate American residents. last year, 2009, I found that that agreement was being violated. I asked for information and they refused to give me the information.